The first question you might have is, why would I want to read this book that was written in 1955? Well, I read it about 35 or 40 years ago for a couple of reasons. One, there's a sense of adventure. As a much younger person, it seemed to be very adventurous. How could a person have led such a diverse army, including elephants, across the Alps in Europe? I don't think I could lead this dog across the Alps in Europe. So this has a sense of adventure and success, which intrigued me back then. The other thing that intrigued me was the mystery. For decades, historians had been debating which precise pass did Hannibal follow to get through the Alps. There were really 4 possibilities, and Gavin de Beer concluded that he passed through the pass called Col de Traverset, which is the highest, most treacherous pass of all. He was lampooned. People didn't believe him. He was considered to have a minority opinion on which pass was the actual pass. But interestingly, just about 5 or 6 years ago, some scientists went to the Col de Traverset and took samples at a location that was really the only location for miles where an ancient army could have fed and grazed its donkeys and mules and horses. And they took soil samples, core samples, and they could tell from the depth of those core samples the year from which the sediment was taken from, and they tested the section from the time of Hannibal and when he passed through the Alps, and surprisingly they found an extremely high concentration of microbes using DNA testing that only come from mules and donkeys that would have been part of a huge pack train. So some very recent scientific evidence points to the fact that he was right, and all of the others, supposedly majority opinions, were wrong. So this caused me to reread this book this year, and I got some surprising bonuses in reading this book. First, I learned a lot about leadership. I mean, today, much ink is spilled over what makes a good leader. Can you make a good leader, or is it all innate? Many corporations spend tens of thousands of dollars in leadership training as if they could make a leader out of nothing. But what I learned here is that not only was Hannibal a great leader, he was a great leader of a diverse team, a team that's perhaps the most diverse in all of history. I have some pictures here of some of his team members. His army was constructed of extremely diverse groups, including Numidian horsemen, here pictured here in the back of this, who were from Africa, and they were light horsemen who carried just a few spears and a very small shield, and they were used for hit and run tactics. They didn't want to stick around for a big melee. They could only be used to perhaps harass the Romans. He also included heavy cavalry, including these Iberian Spanish horsemen who loved to get into a melee with the Romans and to fight it out and stick it out in one big fight. They had heavily armored breastplates and other protection against Roman swords. He had Balearic slingers, people who were from the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean, who used slings not just to hunt small animals, but as a weapon of warfare. He had, perhaps my favorite, were the Gauls. The Gauls were from regions of modern-day France, and they had an interesting technique to fight before they met Hannibal. They liked to fight completely in the nude, without any shield. And apparently it didn't dawn on them that the Romans were onto something with these shields, because the shields could stop the Roman sword thrust a little bit better than their skin could. But Hannibal convinced them that, those Romans are onto something. You ought to use a shield. So many of the Gauls began to use and adopt the Roman shields. So he had these incredibly diverse teams, if you will. They had different religions. They had different methods of making war on others. They had all different languages. And somehow he was able to lead these teams successfully over the Alps. And I learned a lot about that, which I'll get to in a second. Well, how did he do it? You get in this book some examples of how he was able to lead such a diverse team. First, I think one of the things he did is he suffered the same hardships as the different groups. When they would camp at night and it was a cold, rocky place where all they had was a single blanket, he didn't have a special tent for the commander with lots of furs or anything like that. He would roll up with a single blanket like the rest of his army and suffer the same hardships. Now, if I were in that army, I would want a well-rested leader who would make good decisions. But apparently, they thought this was great, and that endeared him to them very much. So, second, he addressed them frequently and gave them speeches that were designed to increase their morale and to motivate them, not just after or before a big event, but during the event. And one of the most famous examples of that is when he reached the top of the pass that he used to cross the Alps. He addressed all of his men, and in the background, behind him, his army could see Italy from this top of the pass. And he said, "Look, before you is the end goal that we're all seeking. Don't quit now. Keep going." This was an important story from the ancients that Gavin de Beer points to, because he figured out that this was the only one of the four passes where there was a structure that would have allowed him to address a large part of his army with Italy visible in the background. So this was a key piece of both the book and Hannibal's leadership. Finally, he had a sense of humor. He was in a battle and he was heavily outnumbered, and one of his lieutenants was named Gisgo. And Gisgo was freaking out. He noticed that the Romans had 10 times the number of troops that they had. And Hannibal said, "Yes, but there are none by the name of Gisgo." Apparently this was funny back then. I don't know why. Maybe he was shaming him for freaking out. Maybe he was trying to assure him that he had confidence in him. But in any event, he clearly had a sense of humor and used it in leadership. So one of the other happy coincidences here, when I reread this here 40 years later, is I learned something about research. I mean, nowadays we all rely on AI and machine learning, and we really don't do the hard work for research. But after reading this book, I realized that it was Gavin de Beer's research that taught him the truth, if in fact the Col de Traverset was the passageway of Hannibal, which the scientific evidence is pointing to. And here's how he did it. First, he had a meticulous sense of detail. There were basically two ancient sources, Polybius and Livy, and those two sources wrote about the passage through the Alps. And it wasn't good enough for Gavin de Beer just to read English translations of the original Latin. He went to the source material and looked at every word of that source material, and he found what he felt was a mistake in the original translation of a key river that was supposed to be present when Hannibal entered the pass through the Alps. And through his meticulous research, he was able to identify the proper name and the river that was nearby when Hannibal entered the pass. The other thing he did was he noticed something that was pretty interesting to me. The ancient Gauls in France were tribal, and the tribes had boundaries. He found out that the Catholic Church in France had used those identical same boundaries to set up their diocese. So he knew where a particular tribe was located because of the current diocese and boundaries of the Catholic Church. And so he was able to tell whether or not a particular tribe was nearby according to the ancient text, which I also found to be super interesting. So he was very meticulous and had a great sense of detail, but at the same time, he was also open-minded. He very much respected the ancient texts, and when Gavin de Beer's adversaries in the debate would dismiss a particular story from the ancient sources, he wasn't so quick to do so. There's a famous story that when Hannibal got to a certain part of the passageway, he could not get the animals, and especially the elephants, through because it was too narrow. So what the story says is he poured vinegar into crevices in the rock, allowed it to freeze, to break the rock up and to dissolve the rock so that he could widen the passageway to get the elephants through. Gavin de Beer's opponents said this was a fanciful tale. It doesn't work. Vinegar does not dissolve rock. This was just something made up by these ancient sources to break up the monotony of reading. It was just an interesting story that had no truth. But he established two things. One, ancient armies used a lot of vinegar for many, many different purposes. And two, in fact, if you freeze vinegar or a water, it does expand with incredible force enough to break rock. So it is possible that the sources were accurate, and he was able to pass the Alps using that technique. And so what I found with reading this book is that you can start reading a book for one reason, but find multiple reasons to enjoy it, and those reasons can change over the years as you learn more and more and additional information comes to light. Thank you for listening.